The pilot is in fact not the pilot episode of Doctor Who. That was 54 years earlier and was never broadcast. No, in fact the pilot is actually the first episode of Series 10, the final series in the Moffat era, and one that's actually rather important for me personally, as it's probably the first time I was watching Doctor Who with a properly critical eye and a more mature critical perspective. Unfortunately, it was 7 years ago, and most of what I actually thought of those episodes in more detailed critical terms is lost to memory, but nevertheless the idea of this being the first series I was able to do that with is an interesting one as to see how that transfers here. Spoilers, the answer is not very much, but at least I tried. Of course, I still retain my view of the series as a whole, which I can sum up in one word: mediocre. Setting aside the final two episodes, which are a completely different discussion entirely, it's mostly a series without any real enormous highs, but also with no dreadful lows either. There are bad episodes to be sure, but nothing like The Caretaker or Sleep No More. For me, it's mostly just a so-so series, with a bunch of pretty average and mostly forgettable episodes. This feeling is probably exacerbated by a few reasons. It was the first time the series had been properly on air in 18 months, just a single episode aired in 2016. This probably meant that the series felt more stale than it probably should have done. Related to this is the fact that the structural changes in media consumption that had been prevalent over the last few years were beginning to take hold around this point, which meant that the low ratings that have been a feature of the show ever since really started to here. It's obviously a different situation to the classic series' decline, and it's worth repeating, of course, that ratings don't really mean anything anymore, certainly not the case even they did 20 years ago, but nevertheless it did at the time feel like fatigue with the series was beginning to seriously present itself. Additionally, by now it's generally accepted that Moffat actually wanted to leave after The Husbands of River Song at the end of 2015, and only stayed because there wasn't really a successor. That, combined with the news of Capaldi bowing out and knowledge that whatever was going to happen, radical changes were afoot. This series felt to me at least almost redundant at the time. I'm not sure if that's quite the right word, but hopefully you understand what I'm getting at there. After all, The Husbands of River Song had been the ending of one of this era's most important plot and character threads, and combined with how Series 9 had wrapped up several other threads, most of all the story of she who shall not be named, it did feel as if that would have been a natural ending point for the era, leaving behind a capable actor in the main role for a new showrunner to have a go with. Doing more beyond that still to this day feels like it was going beyond where it really needed to go. Despite that though, I do think Moffat's heart was still in it, and for good or bad, it still feels very much part of his overall era in style and presentation. I also credit that the decision for the series' overall storyline was taking pretty much the only thread that hadn't been wrapped up, and expanded on and developed it. That is very much a discussion for another day, of course, as it's not really a feature of this episode, but it is worth bearing in mind when comparing this episode to the rest of its series. Therefore, it's difficult not to look back on this episode as essentially feeling a little redundant, introducing a new companion and setting the first seeds of a new storyline that were guaranteed to last no longer than the single series. However, there are some things the episode does in order to alleviate this that it does need credit for, so don't think I'm saying this episode, and indeed series, isn't without merit. It is just needs to be the context that it's in does need to be remembered. Anyway, going on to the pilot itself. First of all, we'll look at the production as always. The episode was directed by Lawrence Gough? I've never known how to pronounce his surname. Let's call him Lawrence Gough. Another Moffat-era director with very few credits for the show. He directed just the one production block, this episode and the next one, Smile. On the basis of this episode, I can't say I'm particularly sorry we didn't see more of him, because I was not particularly impressed with his work on this episode, I have to say. It wasn't awful or incompetent or anything like that, it's just very weird and, if I'm honest, not particularly effective. The issues vary. Sometimes it's just quite elementary stuff. For instance, the lack of any tension in the scene where Heather gets whatever happens to her here with the puddle. She's just there and then she isn't, which is fine if you want to use that for shock or surprise value, but the way it's pulled off that just doesn't bring that across at all. It just happens and then that's it. There's also a few moments which do have some promise that end up falling flat. The first time Bill sees watery Heather in the grounds of the university should be a creepy moment, and it does sort of manage it at first, but it's just dragged out for way too long, to the point where it honestly just sort of becomes a bit silly, her standing there covered in water like that. Because of that, it lacks the punch and any tension that should have come from that. And then there's the frankly bizarre. Throughout the story, there are bits where it goes all artistic on us, with frankly bizarre and surreal montage-type interludes. They are at best distracting, but there's worse to come. It all culminates at the end, you see. Bill needs to let go of Heather, accepting that she needs to let her go in order to save them from the puddle monster thing, in what should have been, despite the issues in the script I'll get to, an important emotional moment. Instead, we get this bizarre 2001 style bit that just completely took me out of it. This told me nothing about the relationship between these two people and how tragedy has struck it apart. It was just weird and confusing and killed any emotional weight there needed to be to make this ending worthwhile. Bill was reluctant to let go, then sees all these weird CGI images, and then decides actually she is ready to let go. Good, glad we worked that out. To be honest, I'm not even sure how much more I have to say about all this, other than it just strikes me as the director either completely misreading what kind of show this is, or just trying to show off and be different. God knows I want directors to do more than just point and shoot sometimes, but there are limits to this, and this stuff crosses it. It's weird, distracting, and unnecessary. I'll give credit where it's due, there are a few good moments. The final scene between the Doctor and Bill where they argue about her right to remember feels quite personal and tense, and that works. And I do like some of the shot choices throughout, which shows I'm not against being a bit unconventional, it's just I'm against whatever the living fuck that was, but let's put it that way. As for the rest of the production, this was clearly meant to be largely done on the cheap, with generic sets and easy locations, and that's fine of course. Some episodes need to be cheaper than others, and the script was a pretty good choice of where to save some money, but it also means there's not really much to talk about other than that. There is one thing though, one of the most insane, baffling and bizarre choices ever made by a Doctor Who production team. In the opening credits, the Doctor's face moves from between the second actor credit and the logo to between the logo and the episode credit, to which I can ask, why? In what world was this totally unnecessary change in any way a good idea? It completely disrupts the flow of the titles, and it makes the face seem like an afterthought when previously it fit in perfectly at that point. My only guess is it was the only way to fit in Matt Lucas's credit, but then surely it would have been better to just slightly speed up Capaldi and Mackie so that you could fit while, not completely ruining the flow of the titles. This is an absolutely insane choice that baffles me to this day. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's analyse another Stephen Moffat script. Hooray. First of all, I want to look at what I do like about the script, and there are two important things I want to highlight in this regard. Firstly, and this is a rarity for a New Who episode, so savour it, I actually do really like the way this episode is structured. Well, let me rephrase that. I like part of the way this episode is structured. The most important bit is that it feels like the pacing is for once just right, and that it is allowed to take its time and be a slow burn. That means it can focus on the important things and allow it all to get proper development, rather than just being lip service so we can get to all the spectacle. And to be honest, this episode feels fairly light on the whole meaningless spectacle thing, at least for most of its length, so well done. Maybe we should try that one in future. Moffat. Anyway, the slower and more thorough pace means that it can particularly focus on the second thing I want to highlight in terms of the things the script does right, the introduction of Bill's character. Now, a general overview of Bill Potts is something I'll leave for another time, and I'll instead focus on her introduction and how allowing this to be a slower paced, lower key tale aids that introduction. The opening scene in the episode is, I think, actually one of the better New Who companion introductions. It is essentially explaining Bill's character through exposition, but said exposition is actually quite natural dialogue between the Doctor and Bill that sets up who she is, why the Doctor is interested in her, and does this in a way that informs on both their characters. Now, the 12th Doctor is being impatient and dismissive of social norms, yet appreciative of those who deserve his appreciation. It's of course well established at this point, but it also works. Establishing Bill as curious and friendly, as well as intelligent and promisingly intelligent enough for the Doctor to want to give her a chance, that also works as well. It's a nice scene, and because the episode is given enough time to breathe, it doesn't feel rushed or frantic like scenes of this nature so often do in New Who. It's an establishing scene and one that sets up the story as it goes, and I like it enough to forgive the gratuitous fan wank of the pictures of River and Susan. It's important to remember though that this is essentially Bill's story at its heart, and the key to that is building her relationship with Heather. Because the episode is only 45 minutes long, there are always going to be some trade-offs, and unfortunately this does mean this relationship doesn't feel as well developed as it should be, and we'll get to this in a bit. But I suppose that's more of a general New Who issue than anything else. But overall though, especially from Bill's side, we understand why she's attracted to Heather, and why she approaches their relationship as she does. These elements of her character weave together in a really good way, like how she's sitting at the back of the Doctor's lectures, and yet also usually a distance away from Heather. It sort of emphasises Bill's decision to stay distant from things. I like that essentially that emotional distance from Heather is reflected in those bits, and indeed that's what makes letting go of her at the end all the more difficult. It comes just as much from regret that she wasn't able to be as close to her as she wanted to be than anything else. Now, it's possible you're asking, but how does all of this factor into Heather only really being an extremely lame Deus Ex Machina in a series finale? And I would give two answers to that. First of all, this is a pre-recorded video, I can't hear you, stop talking to your computer or mobile device. Secondly, I think that it nevertheless works as a linchpin for Bill's character, and reuniting with Heather at the end of her journey was not a bad way to do it. Now, the means by which it was done, now that definitely was a bad way to do it, but we're not reviewing the Doctor Falls right now, we're reviewing this episode, and I think setting that up as the overall arc, her relationship with Heather, I think that was a good idea, and indeed, strictly speaking of this episode, as a setup for that wider character arc, I think it does work pretty well. Now, there are one or two ways I think this character should have been done a bit better, and these are mostly structural issues. For instance, the story behind Bill's relationship with her birth mother sort of comes out of nowhere and then goes nowhere for the rest of the episode. And yes, I get it's set up to be used later on, but it's still jarringly entered into the episode. Her adopted mum more or less says, "Oh, by the way, here's some photos for you to see." She cries about it, and then that's sort of it again. I mean, at least they weren't photos of her mum pointing to a sign that says Bill Street as a means of naming her. That would be really, really stupid, and surely something that would never go into an episode of Doctor Who. Ahem. A bit more importantly, I do also feel that her relationship with the Doctor isn't as well set up as it should be. There are good scenes, for sure, the opening one, as I said, and the closing scene that I also mentioned. The closing scene is actually, I think, one of the best ones they have. It does show Bill is willing to be defiant to the Doctor, despite how she views him. It's actually really good, apart from a link to a certain former companion that Moffat's absolute refusal to ever let us be free of as the single most domineering thread of his era, but never mind. Overall, I think that's actually a pretty good scene. Overall, though, I think that the relationship between the two of them is kind of based a bit too much on assumptions rather than what we're actually shown. The Doctor becomes her tutor, so the audience is left to assume what their relationship is based on that information rather than what's actually being demonstrated. We're led to think, oh, he's a mentor and someone she can confide in, blah blah blah, but we just have to assume that. It's not actually shown, and this does hurt how the relationship is developed. Likewise, I'm not sure in the later stages of the episode we really get a sense of how they're interacting and what was making him realise she has more potential than he thought. It's mostly just stupid and unfunny jokes about the bigger on the inside bit before we end up with exposition about Heather. The natural growth of her settling into the routine of things is just not really there. As a whole, however, I think this is a promising start for Bill, with a solid foundation in terms of making this her story. Mackie gives a very good every woman performance, and ultimately I think this is a great setup for her overall arc, essentially growing from the raw potential we see here as the story goes on. Oh, and as an aside, I find it interesting that in 2017 Doctor Who introduced a woman of colour with a masculine first name and a background as an orphan, while later in the year Star Trek returned to TV introducing a woman of colour with a masculine first name as a background and a background as an orphan. Life can be funny that way, eh? But overall, I do like the way Bill is introduced in this story, and I do overall like her as a companion, so I think the episode does well in that regard. Anyway, there are other parts of the story that work for me because of how it's structured. I think the main example I'd give there is the Monster of the Week. I think it's quite an effective low-key monster that works very well for how the story episode is structured. It doesn't need any time to possibly set up and show, and despite some silliness, I think it's actually quite an effectively creepy creature at times. Its very, very alien nature works to its advantage. This is unfortunately undermined by the baffling decision to have some "we are the bad guys" voiceover early on when they're still just a puddle, which does sort of spoil the tension of it a bit. It sort of adds a humanising factor to them which they really shouldn't have had. They worked really well as just this totally alien being. But that is a minor thing overall. I think it's actually a fairly decent enemy. As for the Doctor himself, well, I said this is mostly Bill's story, not his, and because of that there's nothing too massive for him. I will say actually that I do like when a Doctor settles down somewhere. I think it shows a more nuanced side of him, and sometimes that he has needs and pleasures other than what you'd expect. And therefore I like the whole settling down to teach at university thing. It does seem very much in character for the Doctor, and especially this one. I also do like how he picks up on Bill's potential so quickly, and that's how he comes to tutor her. It does seem a bit obvious that he would pick up on the talents of a less fortunate person like that, but it's a bit of an observation I like anyway. It's a very doctory thing. Capaldi's on fine form as always, so while I think this isn't a massively important outing for the Doctor himself, it's more about setting up his companion, I think there's still stuff here to appreciate. Of course, Nardole was in this as well, but he's still just comic relief at this point. His character development hasn't really started yet. He does have a few funny lines, and Matt Lucas is a good performer for him, but overall I don't think it's that significant here. Anyway, you may recall I said earlier that I like the structure, but only up to an extent. And that, I think, is probably the main problem with this episode. Some of the structure does work, but just as much of it really, really doesn't, and it is where it begins to fall apart. I appreciate the slower pace and the more spread out structure, but not everything that's done with it. And I think the chief problem is how it doesn't use that time anything like effectively as it should. As I said earlier, I'm not sure the Bill-Heather relationship is established as well as it should be, and while, as I said, I accept a lot of it is because you only have 45 minutes to play with, I nevertheless get a sense from how these scenes are structured and written that they've only really had about 4 conversations, and that detracts from the ending where the whole point is Bill letting go of someone who matters to her. Like, I think it would have been very easy to set these two up as a genuinely romantic figure that would have made that ending a lot more impactful, while also continuing the theme of Bill's distance and her not wanting to fully commit to that kind of thing. So I think that should have been done, and I think it is a shame that it isn't, because it just sort of undermines the connection here. It's essentially Bill being incredibly torn up and abandoning someone she's had maybe about 5 conversations with. So for that doesn't really work for me. And equally to this, everyone, even including Bill, but especially the Doctor, seem remarkably calm and sedate about the fact that Heather has essentially been murdered by this creature. This is a woman who was studying in a university who had a bright future, and it was someone who Bill genuinely did really care about, and they really could have been interesting and happy together. She's had that life snatched away from her, and the main characters seem mostly interested in the technical aspects of it, what this creature is and how it's following them and how to defeat it, instead of how horrific that is. This is the kind of thing the Doctor should be outraged at, and Bill should be heartbroken at it. And think about how effective a scene that would have been. The Doctor's angry ranting at this creature that has destroyed a life, and Bill barely able to keep it together while he does that. Those are the beats we should have got, but in the end, the Doctor just seems a bit annoyed time has been taken out of his day, and the setup for Bill's reaction to be as effective as it should be, as I said, is just not there. The episode also does seem to be quite uneven in places. Instead of a constant gentle pace, this first half almost seems to be a bit too slow. It's not too bad, but it's sometimes a bit too sedate. But then the second half is all the running around and frantic bits. It seems like it's out of place with what came before. In fact, the second half of the episode is certainly quite a bit weaker than the first. Whatever its issues, at least the first half at least felt a bit consistent and like it was building towards something. There are a few time-wasting bits like Bill following the Doctor and Nardole into the vault area, which we'll end up seeing later anyway. But it nevertheless stays focused, and as I said, it does feel consistent, like we're learning about Bill and her life. The second half, however, just gets carried away with all the chasing around. It just feels like a distraction from the main plot and character beats. I get it, yeah, you have to show the new companion how the TARDIS works, and it's the important thing you need to do, but on the other hand it does create tonal issues, which is the other big problem with the second half. On the one hand, this is an extremely creepy creature that has consumed the new companion's love interest, and is now chasing her relentlessly, but also we have to have shit Moffat-y jokes about how Bill's not correctly reacting to it being bigger on the inside, and we're just going to Australia and random BBC quarries because why not? It feels like the focus is lost, and it's a shame because even the extra few minutes that would have generated by being excised would have made a huge difference in terms of developing the relationships and dynamics of work here, between Bill and the Doctor, Bill and Heather, etc. I mean, yeah, it's New Who, and especially in the Moffat era, tonal issues are what you expect, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating when it does cut into what's happening. Also, I know it doesn't really matter, so I'm sorry to be like this, but frankly, the addition of the fanwank stuff is distracting more than anything else. Earlier on, they kept cutting to the pictures of River and Susan, which was bad enough, but the fact that the Movellans are in this just adds nothing apart from oh look, they're those guys from Destiny of the Daleks. And man, are they not beating the Daleks have to be in every series allegation with how they are pointlessly shoehorned in here. That's pretty minor though, as I said. The main thing that does let this down is the unevenness and the lack of coherence in the second half. And this causes the story to drop away from focusing on the aspects that had worked earlier on. Oh, and there's everyone's favourite thing to talk about, logical issues. I'll just stick to the most important one this time, which is that the time frame of the episode is very, very unclear. We seemingly go from autumn to Christmas to what seems to be late winter or early spring, without any real sign that time is passing in terms of the relationship between, say, Bill and the Doctor. Ultimately, though, it makes it even worse that Bill and Heather appears to have about 4 conversations in that time period, which means they're averaging about a conversation a month, which makes the development of their relationship even less well thought out than it should be. They had a party in the autumn, saw a puddle soon afterwards, then went several months without speaking. This is clearly the sign of 2 people who care deeply for each other, the death of one being a defining moment for the other, and clearly once they've both turned into puddles, they'll travel the universe together. All between 2 people who speak to each other less than I speak to the bloke at the corner shop. I also think there's way too much focus on the stuff with the vault. I mean, I get it, it's part of the overarching story for the series, but in this episode on its own it goes absolutely nowhere, and the bit where the water is approaching them is muted by the Doctor and Nardole squabbling over it. Again, tonal issues, eh? And to be honest, I'm not sure how much would have been lost if it had just been cut down to maybe a cameo or two, or 1 or 2 lines, given all this is doing is setting up that it exists and it's important. And given the overarching storyline is actually about who's in the vault, which gets revealed a few episodes later anyway, not what the vault is and how to protect it or anything like that, I think this is just pointless dead air, unfortunately. Overall, therefore, the pilot is an episode that lives and dies on how it's structured. A slower, more thoughtful pace and a more personal, low-key story, it's appreciated, and I like how the opportunity of introducing the new companion is used to do that, and consequently, it works effectively as a means of introducing the new character and making the episode be about her. However, in typical New Who fashion, there are just avoidable structural mistakes, relationships aren't developed enough, ideas aren't fleshed out enough, and a tone cannot be committed to. In a way, it shows to me that Series 10 was just really more of the same from Moffat, which does link back to what I was saying at the start about how this was a series he probably didn't really want to make. So, why would things change, I suppose? Moffat gonna Moffat in all circumstances. But I think despite the overall stylings and indeed the issues that plague this era being unchanged, I do actually commend the attempt with this episode to do something a bit different. And perhaps more importantly, to introduce a companion who would just act as an every woman, rather than after 7 years of the most important people in the world. So while Series 10 as a whole I think is in the end pretty mediocre, mostly because it's mostly just Moffat-y business chugging along as usual, it does have elements I appreciate, and I think its characters is one of them. And we start out here as the series means to go on. So while this is a pretty bog-standard Moffat-era episode and a pretty bog-standard Moffat-era series, I think it can be commended for the small things it does right. So the final score for this episode, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. I like its approach to structure and character, and think it does a good job with the character the episode is based around. I'm just not really sure about the rest of it. It certainly separates it from what you'd expect from typical New Who episodes, but I think in the end it comes out as an average one because of the stuff tracking it down. It's an agreeable enough watch because of what it does right, but not much more. Probably should have been, but in that respect it's definitely typical of New Who, so yeah, average. Anyway, if you're worried that we're looking at too many Moffat-era episodes without a brain, next time we'll be looking at a story which definitely does have a brain. Yes, it's the brain of Morbius. Oh, and as always, if you have any stories, classical New Who, you'd like to see reviewed, please do let me know in the comments section below. Or above if you're holding a phone that's upside down, or if you're in Australia. Anyway...